Daniel's piety. No greater contrast to Hiram and the false prophets, Ahab and Zedekiah, can be imagined than what is presented by the character of the pious Daniel. When Nebuchadnezzar offered him divine honors, he refused what Hiram wanted to obtain by every means in his power. The Babylonian king felt so ardent an admiration for Daniel that he sent him out of the country when idol worship was demanded, for he knew full well that Daniel would take death in the flames rather than disregard the commands of God, and he could not well throw the man to whom he had paid divine homage into the fire. Moreover, it was God's wish that Daniel not pass through the fiery ordeal at the time of his 3 friends, in order that their deliverance might not be ascribed to him. In spite of all this, Nebuchadnezzar tried to persuade Daniel by gentle means to worship an idol. He had the golden diadem of the high priest inserted in the mouth of an idol, and by reason of the wondrous power that resides in the holy name inscribed on the diadem, the idol gained the ability to speak, and it said, "I am your God." So many were seduced to worship the image. But Daniel could not be misled so easily. He secured permission from the king to kiss the idol. Laying his mouth on the idol's, he whispered to the diadem the following words: "I am but flesh and blood, yet at the same time a messenger of God. I therefore admonish you, take heed that the name of the Holy One is not desecrated. So I order you to follow me." So it happened. When the heathen came with music and songs to give honor to the idol, it emitted no sound, but a storm broke loose and overturned it. On still another occasion, Nebuchadnezzar tried to persuade Daniel to worship an idol. This time, a dragon that devoured all who approached it, therefore adored as a god by the Babylonians. Daniel had straw mixed with nails fed to the dragon, which he ate and perished almost immediately. All this did not prevent Daniel from keeping the welfare of the king in mind continually. Hence it was that when Nebuchadnezzar was engaged in setting his house in order, he wanted to mention Daniel in his will as one of his heirs. But the Jew refused with the words, "Far be it from me to leave the inheritance of my fathers for that of the uncircumcised." Nebuchadnezzar died after reigning 40 years, as long as King David. The death of the tyrant brought hope and joy to many a heart, for his severity had been such that during his lifetime no one even dared laugh. When he ascended into Sheol, its inhabitants trembled, fearing that he had come to reign over them too. However, a heavenly voice called to him, "Go down and lay with the uncircumcised." The interment of this great king was anything but what might have been expected, and for this reason. During the 7 months spent by Nebuchadnezzar among the beasts, his son Evil-Merodach ruled in his stead. Nebuchadnezzar reappeared after this period of penance and imprisoned his son for life. When the death of Nebuchadnezzar actually did occur, Evil-Merodach refused to accept the homage of the nobles brought to him as the new king, because he feared that his father was not dead, but had only disappeared as once before, and would return again. To convince him of the groundlessness of his apprehension, the corpse of Nebuchadnezzar, badly mutilated by his enemies, was dragged through the streets. Shortly afterward, Zedekiah died, the dethroned king of Judah. His burial took place amid great demonstrations of sympathy and mourning. The eulogy over him ran like this: "Alas, that King Zedekiah had to die, he who drank the despair accumulated by all the generations before him." Zedekiah did reach a good old age, for though it was in his reign that the destruction of Jerusalem took place, yet it was the guilt of the nation, not of the king, that had brought about the catastrophe. Belshazzar's Feast. When God resolved to take revenge on Babylon for all the sufferings it had inflicted on Israel, he chose Darius and Cyrus as the agents of the vengeance. Cyrus, the king of Persia, and his father-in-law Darius, the king of Media, together went up against Belshazzar, the ruler of the Chaldeans. The war lasted a considerable time, and fortune found favor first on one side and then the other, until finally the Chaldeans won a decisive victory. To celebrate the event, Belshazzar arranged a great banquet, which was served from the vessels taken out of the temple at Jerusalem by his father. While the king and his guests were feasting, an angel sent by God put Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin on the wall, Aramaic words in Hebrew characters, written with red ink. The angel was seen by none but the king. His grandees and the princes of the realm who were present at the orgy perceived nothing. The king himself did not see the form of the angel, only his awesome fingers, as they wrote the words visible to him. All the astrologers and magicians were called, but they could not interpret the writing. Daniel was then called, and the interpretation given to the enigmatic words by him ran so: God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the balance and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. These words putting an end to the merrymaking, they scattered in dread and fear, leaving no one behind except the king and his attendants. The same night the king was murdered by an old servant who knew Daniel from the time of Nebuchadnezzar and did not doubt this sinister prophecy would be fulfilled. With the head of King Belshazzar, he himself went to Darius and Cyrus and told them how his master had desecrated the sacred vessels, told them of the wonderful writing on the wall, and of the way it had been interpreted by Daniel. The two kings were moved by this recital and made a solemn vow that they would permit the Jews to return to Palestine and would grant them the use of the temple vessels. Then they resumed the war against Babylon with increased energy, and God gave them victory. They conquered the whole of Belshazzar's realm and took possession of the city of Babylon, whose inhabitants, young and old, were made to suffer death. The subjugated lands were divided between Cyrus and Darius, the latter receiving Babylon and Media, the former Chaldea, Persia, and Assyria. But this is not the whole story of the fall of Babylon. The wicked king Belshazzar arranged the banquet at which the holy vessels were desecrated in the 5th year of his reign, because he thought it was certain that all danger was past regarding Jeremiah's prophecy, foretelling the return of the Jews to Palestine at the end of 70 years of Babylonian rule. Nebuchadnezzar had governed 57 years, and evil Merodach 8, leaving 5 years in the reign of Belshazzar for the fulfillment of the appointed time. Not enough that the king had scoffed at God by using the temple vessels, he had the pastry for the banquet, which was given on the 2nd day of Passover, made of flour finer than that used on this day for the omer in the temple. Punishment followed hard on the heels of the atrocity. On the evening of the banquet, the doorkeepers of the royal palace had received orders to admit no one, even if he said he was the king himself. Belshazzar was forced to leave his apartments for a short time, and he went out, unnoticed by the two doorkeepers. On his return, when he asked to be admitted, they killed him, even while he was crying out that he was the king. Daniel under the Persian kings. Daniel left Belshazzar and fled to Shustar, where he was received kindly by Cyrus, who promised him to have the temple vessels taken back to Jerusalem, provided Daniel would pray to God to grant him success in his war with the king of Mosul. God gave Daniel's prayer a favorable hearing, and Cyrus was true to his promise. Daniel now received the divine order to urge Cyrus to rebuild the temple. To this end, he was told to introduce Ezra and Zerubbabel to the king. Ezra then went from place to place and called the people to return to Palestine. Sad to say, only a tribe and a half obeyed his summons. Indeed, the majority of the people, who had taken up Babylonian ways, were so angry against Ezra that they wanted to kill him. He escaped the peril only by a divine miracle. Daniel, too, was exposed to much suffering at this time. Cyrus cast him into a den of lions, because he refused to bow down before the idol of the king. For 7 days Daniel lay among the wild beasts, and not a hair of his head was touched. When the king, at the end of the week, found Daniel alive, he had to acknowledge the sovereign grandeur of God. Cyrus released Daniel and instead had his enemies thrown to the lions. In an instant, they were torn to pieces. In general, Cyrus fell far short of coming up to the expectations set for him in piety and justice. Though he granted permission to the Jews to rebuild the temple, they were to use no material but wood, so that it might easily be destroyed by fire if the Jews should later rebel against him. On this point, the Persian king laid himself open to reproach. Yet at another time Cyrus urged Daniel to pay homage to the idol Bel. As proof of the divinity of the idol, the king said that it ate the food set before it. A report spread by the priests of Bel, who entered the temple of the idol at night through subterranean passages, later attributing the disappearance to the appetite of the god. But Daniel was too shrewd to be misled by a fabricated story. He had ashes strewn on the floor of the temple, and the footprints visible the next morning convinced the king of the deceit practiced by the priests. Pleasant relations did not continue forever between Cyrus and Darius. A war broke out between them, and Cyrus lost his life and lands. Fearing Darius, Daniel fled to Persia, but an angel of the Lord appeared to him with the message, "Fear not the king. I will not surrender you to him." Shortly afterward, he received a letter from Darius reading as follows, "Come to me, Daniel. Fear nothing. I will be even kinder to you than Cyrus was." Accordingly, Daniel returned to Shushtar, and was received with great consideration by Darius. One day, Darius happened to remember the sacred garments brought by Nebuchadnezzar out of the temple at Jerusalem to Babylon. They had vanished, and no trace of them could be discovered. The king suspected Daniel of having something to do with their disappearance. It mattered little that Daniel protested his innocence. He was thrown into prison. Then God sent an angel to blind Darius, telling him at the same time that he was deprived of his sight because he was keeping the pious Daniel in prison, and sight would be restored to him only if Daniel interceded in prayer. The king at once released Daniel, and the two together journeyed to Jerusalem to pray at the holy place for the restoration of the king. An angel appeared to Daniel and announced to him that his prayer had been heard. The king had only to wash his eyes, and vision would return. So it happened. Darius gave thanks to God, and in his gratitude assigned the tenth of his grain to the priests and the Levites. Besides this, he testified his appreciation to Daniel by loading him down with gifts, and both returned to Shushtar. The recovery of the king convinced many of his subjects of the omnipotence of God, and they converted to Judaism. Following the advice of Daniel, Darius appointed a triumvirate to take charge of the administration of his realm, and Daniel was made chief of the council of three. This high dignity, he was second to none but the king himself, exposed him to envy and hostility on all sides. His enemies plotted his ruin. Cunningly, they induced the king to sign an order, attaching the penalty of death to prayers addressed to any god or man other than Darius. Though the order did not require Daniel to commit a sin, he preferred to give up his life for the honor of the one true God. When his jealous enemies surprised him during his prayers, he did not interrupt himself. He was then dragged before the king, who refused to give credence to the charge against Daniel. Meantime, the hour for the afternoon prayer arrived, and in the presence of the king and his princes, Daniel began to perform his devotions. This rendered useless all efforts by the king to save his friend from death. Daniel was cast into a pit full of lions. The entrance to the pit was closed up by a rock, which had of its own accord rolled from Palestine, to protect him against any harm contemplated by his enemies. The lions welcomed the pious Daniel, like dogs fawning on their master on his return home, licking his hands and wagging their tails. While this was happening in Babylon, an angel appeared to the prophet Habakkuk in Judea. He ordered the prophet to bring Daniel the food he was about to carry his laborers in the field. Astonished, Habakkuk asked the angel how he could carry it so great a distance, but then he was seized by his hair and in a moment set down before Daniel. They dined together, and then the angel transported Habakkuk back to his place in Palestine. Early the next morning, Darius went to the pit of the lions to discover the fate of Daniel. The king called his name, but he received no answer, because Daniel was reciting the Shema, after having spent the night in praise and adoration of God. Seeing that he was still alive, the king summoned the enemies of Daniel to the pit. It was their opinion that the lions had not been hungry, and therefore Daniel was still unhurt. The king commanded them to test the beasts with their own bodies. The result was that 122 enemies of Daniel, together with their wives and children, numbering 244 people altogether, were torn into shreds by 1,464 lions. The miraculous escape of Daniel brought him even more distinguished consideration and greater honors than before. The king published the wonders done by God in all parts of the land, and called on the people to go to Jerusalem and help in the erection of the temple. Daniel then entreated the king to relieve him of the duties of his position, for on account of his advanced age he no longer felt himself fit. The king consented on condition that Daniel designate a worthy successor. His choice fell on Zerubbabel. Loaded with rich presents, and amid public demonstrations designed to honor him, Daniel retired from public life. He settled in the city of Shushan, where he lived until his end. Though he was no prophet, God gave him a knowledge of the end of time not granted his friends, the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. But even he in his old age lost all memory of the revelation with which he had been favored. The grave of Daniel. Daniel was buried in Shushan, and on this account a quarrel was kindled among the inhabitants of the city. Shushan is divided in two parts by a river. The side containing the grave of Daniel was occupied by the wealthy, and the poor lived on the other side. The latter maintained that they too would be rich if the grave of Daniel was on their side. The frequent disputes and conflicts were finally adjusted by a compromise. One year the casket reposed on one side of the river, and the next year on the other. When the Persian king Sanjar came to Shushan, he put a stop to the practice of dragging the casket hither and thither. He resorted to another device to guard the peace of the city. He had the casket suspended from chains precisely in the middle of the bridge spanning the river. In the same spot he erected a house of prayer for all confessions, and out of respect to Daniel, he prohibited fishing in the river for a distance of a mile on either side of the memorial building. The sacredness of the spot was revealed when the godless tried to pass by. They were drowned, while the pious remained unscathed. Furthermore, the fish that swam near it had heads glittering like gold. Next to the house of Daniel lay a stone, under which he had concealed the holy temple vessels. Once an attempt was made to roll the stone from its place, but whoever ventured to touch it fell dead. The same fate overtook all who later tried to make excavations near the spot. A storm broke out and mowed them down. Zerubbabel. The successor to Daniel in the service of the king, Zerubbabel enjoyed just as much royal consideration and affection. He occupied a higher position than all the other servants and officials, and he and two others made up the bodyguard of the king. Once, when the king was in deep slumber, the guards resolved to write down what each considered the mightiest thing in the world. He who wrote the wisest saying should be given rich presents and rewards by the king. What they wrote down was put under the king's pillow, that he might make a decision right after he woke up. The first one wrote, "Wine is the mightiest thing there is." The second wrote, "The king is the mightiest on earth." And the third, Zerubbabel, wrote, "Women are the mightiest, but truth prevails over all." When the king awoke and perused the documents, he summoned the grandees of his realm and the three youths as well. Each of the three was called on to justify his saying. In eloquent words, the first described the potency of wine. When it takes possession of a man, he forgets grief and sorrow. Still more beautiful and convincing were the words of the second speaker, when his turn came to establish the truth of his saying that the king was the mightiest on earth. Finally, Zerubbabel depicted in glowing words the power of women, who rule even over kings. But, he continued, truth is supreme over all. The whole earth asks for truth. The heavens sing praises of the truth. All creation quakes and trembles before truth, and nothing wrong can be found in truth. To truth belongs the might, the dominion, the power, and the glory of all times. Blessed be the God of truth. When Zerubbabel stopped speaking, the assembly broke out into the words, "Great is truth. It is mightier than everything else." The king was so charmed with the wisdom of Zerubbabel that he said to him, "Ask for anything you wish. It will be granted you." Zerubbabel required nothing for himself. He only sought permission of the king to restore Jerusalem, rebuild the sanctuary, and return the holy temple vessels. Not only did Darius grant what Zerubbabel wished for, giving him letters of safe conduct, but he also gave numerous privileges to Jews who accompanied Zerubbabel to Palestine, and also sent abundant presents to the temple and its officers. God gave knowledge of the secrets of the future to Zerubbabel, just as he had done previously for Daniel. Especially, the archangel Metatron dealt kindly with him. Besides revealing to him the time at which the Messiah would appear, he brought about an interview for him with the Messiah. In reality, Zerubbabel was none other than Nehemiah, who was given this second name because he was born in Babylon. Richly endowed, as Zerubbabel, Nehemiah was, with admirable qualities, he still had his faults. He was self-complacent and did not hesitate to fasten a stigma on his predecessors, even so excellent a man as Daniel. To punish him for these transgressions, the book of Ezra does not bear the name of its real author, Nehemiah. When Darius felt his end approach, he appointed his son-in-law, Cyrus, who had before reigned only over Persia, to be the ruler over his kingdom as well. His wish was honored by the princes of Media and Persia. So, after Darius departed life, Cyrus was proclaimed king. In the very first year of his reign, Cyrus summoned the most distinguished Jews to appear before him, and he gave them permission to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. More than this, he pledged himself to contribute to the temple in proportion to his means, and pay honor to the God who had given him the strength to subdue the Chaldeans. These actions of Cyrus partly flowed from his own pious inclinations, and partly from his desire to accomplish the dying requests of Darius, who had admonished him to give the Jews the opportunity of rebuilding the temple. When the first sacrifice was brought by the Jews, returned to Jerusalem under the leadership of Ezra, they missed the celestial fire which had dropped down from heaven on the altar in the time of Moses, and had flamed as long as the temple stood. They turned in supplication to God for instructions. The celestial fire had been hidden by Jeremiah at the time of the destruction of the holy city, and the law did not permit them to bring strange fire on the altar of God. An old man suddenly remembered the spot where Jeremiah buried the holy fire, and led the elders to it. They rolled away a stone covering the spot, and from under it appeared a spring flowing not with water, but with a sort of oil. Ezra ordered this fluid to be sprinkled on the altar, and right away an all-consuming flame shot up. The priests scattered in fright. But after the temple and its vessels were purified by the flame, it confined itself to the altar, never again to leave it, for a priest guarded it so that it might not be extinguished. Among the band of returned exiles were the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Each of them had a place of great importance in rebuilding the temple. Haggai showed the people the plan of the altar, larger than the one that had stood in Solomon's temple. Zechariah informed them of the exact location of the altar, and Malachi taught them which sacrifices might be brought to the holy place before the completion of the temple. On the authority of the prophets, the Jews gave up the original Hebrew characters and rewrote the Torah in the Assyrian characters still in use to this day. When the temple work was in progress, the builders found the skull of Araunah, the owner of the temple site in the time of David. The priests, unlearned as they were, could not decide to what extent the corpse lying there had defiled the holy place. It was for this that Haggai poured out his reproaches on them. Ezra. The complete resettlement of Palestine took place under the direction of Ezra, or, as the scriptures sometimes call him, Malachi. He had not been present at the earlier attempts to restore the sanctuary because he could not leave his old teacher Baruch, who was too advanced in years to venture on the difficult journey to the Holy Land. In spite of Ezra's persuasive efforts, it was but a comparatively small portion of the people that joined the procession winding on its way towards Palestine. For this reason, the prophetical spirit did not show itself during the existence of the Second Temple. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi were the last representatives of prophecy. Nothing was more surprising than the apathy of the Levites. They showed no desire to return to Palestine. Their punishment was the loss of the tithes, which were later given to the priests, though the Levites had first claim. In restoring the Jewish state in Palestine, Ezra cherished two hopes: to preserve the purity of the Jewish race and to the spread of the study of the Torah, until it should become the common property of the people at large. For help on the first case, he inveighed against marriages between Jews and the nations around them. In the second of his hopes, the spread of the Torah, Ezra was so zealous and efficient that it was justly said of him, "If Moses had not come before him, Ezra would have received the Torah." In a sense, he was indeed a second Moses. The Torah had fallen into neglect and oblivion, and he restored it in the minds of the people. It is chiefly due to him that it was divided up into portions to be read annually, Sabbath after Sabbath, in the synagogues, and he likewise originated the idea of rewriting the Torah in Assyrian characters. To further his efforts even more, he ordered additional schools for the children to be established everywhere, though the old ones satisfied the present demand. He thought rivalry between the old and new schools would rebound to the benefit of the pupils. Ezra is the originator of the institutions known as the 10 Regulations of Ezra. They are the following: 1. Readings from the Torah on Sabbath afternoons. 2. Readings from the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays. 3. Sessions of court on Mondays and Thursdays. 4. To do laundry work on Thursdays, not Fridays. 5. To eat garlic on Friday, on account of its salutary action. 6. To bake bread early in the morning, that it may be ready for the poor whenever they ask. 7. Women are to cover the lower parts of their bodies with a garment called sinar. 8. Before taking a ritual bath, the hair is to be combed. 9. The ritual bath prescribed for the unclean is to cover the case of one who wants to offer prayer or study the law. And 10. Permission to peddlers to sell cosmetics to women in the towns. Ezra was not only a great teacher and a wise leader, he was also their advocate with the Celestials, to whom his relation was of an intimate character. Once he addressed a prayer to God in which he complained of the misfortune of Israel and the prosperity of the heathens. Then the angel Uriel appeared to him and instructed him how evil had its appointed time to run its course, as the dead have their appointed time to sojourn in the netherworld. Ezra could not rest satisfied with this explanation, and in response to his further questions, 7 prophetic visions were given and interpreted by the angel. They typified the whole course of history up to his day and disclosed the future to his eyes. In the 7th vision, he heard a voice from a thorn bush, like Moses before, and it admonished him to guard the secrets revealed to him. The same voice had given Moses a similar injunction: "These words will you publish, these you will keep secret." Then his early translation from earth was announced to him. he begged God to let the Holy Spirit descend on him before he died, so that he might record all that had happened since the creation of the world, as it had been set down in the Torah, to guide men on the path that leads to God. Then God told him to take the 5 experienced scribes, Sarga, Dabria, Seleucia, Ethan, and Aziel, with him into retirement, and dictate to them for 40 days. After 1 day spent with these writers in isolation, removed from the city and from men, a voice admonished him, "Ezra, open your mouth, and drink thereof which I give you to drink." He opened his mouth, and a chalice was handed to him, filled to the brim with a liquid that flowed like water, but in color resembled fire. His mouth opened to drink, and for 40 days it was not closed. During all that time the 5 scribes put down, in signs they did not understand, the newly adopted Hebrew characters, all that Ezra dictated to them, and made 94 books. At the end of the 40 days, God spoke to Ezra, "Publish the 24 books of the Holy Scriptures for the worthy and the unworthy alike, but the last 70 books you must withhold from the populace for the perusal of the wise." On account of this literary activity, he is called the scribe of the science of the Supreme Being to all eternity. Having finished his task, Ezra was removed from this mundane world and entered the life everlasting. But his death did not occur in the Holy Land. It overtook him at Khuzestan, in Persia, on his journey to King Artakshasta. At Rasia, in Mesopotamia, there stood as late as the 12th century the synagogue founded by Ezra when he was journeying from Babylonia to Palestine. At his grave, over which columns of fire are often seen to hover at night, a miracle once happened. A shepherd fell asleep by its side. Ezra appeared to him and told him to tell the Jews that they were to transport his casket to another spot. If the master of the new place refused permission, he was to be warned to yield, or else all the inhabitants of his place would perish. At first the master refused to allow the necessary excavations to be made. Only after a large number of the non-Jewish inhabitants of the place had been stricken down suddenly did he consent to have the corpse transported there, and as soon as the grave was opened, the plague ceased. Shortly before the death of Ezra, the city of Babylon was totally destroyed by the Persians. There remained only a small portion of the wall which was said to be impregnable by human strength. All the prophecies hurled against the city by the prophets were accomplished. To this day there is a spot on its site which no animal can pass unless some of the earth of the place is thrown on it. Next, the men of the great assembly.